Welcome back to Knowledge is Kings, guys. I am Kings, and today we will be continuing our Building Basics series and going over how to frame a hip roof. If you haven't seen the previous videos, especially the framing a gable roof, you may want to watch those videos first. And stick around the end for a little bonus tip. Without further ado, let's get to it. So just like the last video, I want to go over where the numbers for the hip rafters come from. The first thing we need to do is find the length of the hip rafter. We will still be using our 3x3 model we used last time. So looking down from the top of the model, the hip goes at a 45-degree angle from the corner. For our first calculation, we need to find out what the horizontal distance is from the outside of the corner of our model to the inside corner where the hip meets the ridge board. As the run is 18 inches, that and the hip travels at 45 degrees, that means that our triangle for finding the horizontal distance of the hip rafter is 18 by 18, with the hypotenuse of the triangle being the horizontal distance the hip travels. This distance is x. To solve for x, using the Pythagorean theorem, we can take the square root of 18 squared times 2, which gives us 25.448. This is the horizontal distance the hip travels. Now we can use this to find the length of the hip rafter. So the next triangle we are going to use is the horizontal distance as the run and the height of the roof as the rise. So that means that the hypotenuse of this triangle will be the length of the hip rafter. If we remember from our last video, the height of the roof is 6 inches. So with our new triangle, we can find x by taking the square root of 25.4 squared plus 6 squared, which gives us 26.15. Now remember, this is the hip rafter's length to the outside corner of the wall. This doesn't include the overhang. Now in order to use our framing square, we need to know what numbers to line up on the blade and tongue with our rafter. The total rise of the hip is 6, and the total run is 25.4. So we can make a new rise and run ratio with these numbers. We will still hold the framing square on the 4 lined up with our hip, so we will use that for our rise, but we don't know what the run will be, so we will call that x. Then we will set that equal to the total rise and run we calculated, 6 over 25.4. So x is equal to the product of 4 and 25.4 divided by 6, which is 16.97. In the framing world, we round that up to 17. So our rise and run for a 4/12 slope on the hip is 4 over 17. These are the values we will use on our framing square. We can also calculate the angle of the hip rafter. We will call that angle x, so the tangent of x is the quotient of 6 and 25.4. To get x by itself, we take the arctangent of 6 over 25.4, and we get 13.27 degrees, which is the angle the hip goes up and also the angle of our plumb cuts for the hip. Let's go back to the length of the hip rafter. The length we calculated is actually to this point, but as you can see, the hip rafter actually goes only to this point, so we need to calculate first the horizontal distance that we need to remove. The ridge board is 1.5 inches wide, and we only need half of that, which is 3/4. And since the value that we are trying to find is going at a 45-degree angle, that means that both legs of the triangle we are using will be 3/4. So to solve for x, we take the square root of the product of 3/4 squared and 2, which is 1.06 inches. Now that we have the horizontal length, we can use our 4:17 ratio we already calculated to find the rise of this small area. We set 4 over 17 equal to x, the unknown rise, over 1.06. And when we solve for x, we get 0.2496. Now that we have the rise and run of the small area, we can calculate the actual length we need to remove from our hip rafter. Using the same process as before, we get a length of 1.0868. And to get that into a fraction of 1/16 of an inch, we take off the whole inch amount and multiply by 16, which gives us 1.3388. This is how many 1/16 0.0868 is. We'll round that down to 1, so 1/16 of an inch. So we are going to subtract 1 and 1/16 of an inch from our hip length. So our new hip length is 25 and 1/16 inch long. If you know trigonometry, we could calculate the length we are taking off the hip with just the horizontal distance we calculated earlier, since we know the angle of the hip. We can take the cosine of that angle, which is 13.27, and that resultant is equal to the quotient of 1.06 and x, where x is the total length of the hip we are removing. And when we solve for x, we get the same 1.08 we found before. Now the last thing we still need to calculate is the overhang of the hip. For this, I'm only going to calculate the horizontal distance of the overhang. We can use the framing square to step off the actual measurement. You also have a bunch of examples now you could follow to get the actual length if you wanted, but I'll skip it for now. In our model, we are using an overhang of 6 inches, and this is from the two planes perpendicular to each other, each 45 degrees from the hip. So our triangle is 6 base and 6 height. And when we solve for x, we get 8.485, and when we multiply 0.485 by 16, we get about 8, which is 8/16, which reduces to half. So the total horizontal distance of the overhang is 8.5 inches. On to the framing section. I'm going to use the model we used in our last video, so I need to cut off 17.25 inches, or 17.25 inches, from the ridge board. I don't want to cut off the ridge at 18 because then the points of the intersecting boards would be slightly higher than the ridge board. And in order for my plywood sheets to sit nicely at the peak, I would need to plane a bunch of edges down. Once it's cut down, I add back one of the common rafters I removed, attaching it this time at the center of the run, and then it lines up with the top of the ridge board. Now I have a corner for my hip to nestle into. To lay out the hip, I want to stay away from the end of the board at least an inch. You'll see why in a bit. The first mark I make is a plumb cut, and it represents the tail end of the rafter. Before moving the framing square over, remember that the blade of the framing square represents the horizontal travel of the hip. So we can make a mark on the framing square at 8.5 inches, and this is where our overhang starts. I'm using my tape measure because the sticker on the framing square covers all the numbers. Then I just slide my framing square over to that mark and make another mark. I'm going to step off the length of the hip as well, and then just check to see how close our calculated length was. It should be 25 1/16 inch. Looks right on. Now we need to make a seat cut. The length we came down from the top of our common rafters in the last video was 2.5 inches, but we can't come down that distance from our line that marks the outside of the wall because it isn't the same point as it is on the common rafters. We need to make a mark on our wall at a point where our hip touches the outer wall at the same point where the common rafters touch the outer wall, and make a line from there perpendicular to the travel line of the hip rafter. Then we measure back to that point from the outer corner of the wall. This is how far back we need to measure from our plumb cut that represents the outer wall. So I measure back and make a new line. This is where I can measure down the 2.5 inches we want for the seat cut. Now this was just a reference line, so I make sure to scribble it out so I don't accidentally cut it. I still need to cut the original line, I just couldn't measure the seat height from there, as it would then be too tall once I set it in place, and it wouldn't plane out with the common rafters. Now the start and end plumb cuts that we have made at each end need some more work. These are the farthest points on the rafter, and we need them to be cut to a point. Doing the same to each end, I mark the end of one of the marks across the edge of the rafter and find the center point, which is 3/4 of an inch along that line. Then I make a couple of 45-degree marks from the edge of the board to that center mark on each side. This is an easy spot to make a mistake and draw the 45-degree marks in the wrong direction, so I need to make sure that the point points towards the ends of the board. Then I need to mark the new ends on both sides with a plumb line. Then I repeat this process on the other end. One thing you always want to make sure of when you cut rafters is that the plumb lines are all parallel with each other. If one looks like a backslash and the others look like a forward slash, something is wrong. This is a common mistake with new carpenters on the hip rafter, to make one of the plumb cuts going the wrong way, because on the ends they need to make a mark on both sides, and one side is done correctly and the other side is done opposite, because once they flip the board over, they forget to also put the framing square on the other side. Once everything is ready to cut, I like to have two saws so that I can always have one set to 45 degrees. That way I don't need to switch back and forth. But one saw works fine. You would just need to switch between 45 degrees and 90 degrees in between cuts. The next common mistake is to cut the 45-degree angle from the wrong side. Here you can see I double check which direction I need to draw the line on the other side, which I apparently forgot to do. Here is how I like to double check the blade is going at the correct angle. I hold my hand at the angle the line needs to be cut. Then I check to make sure my blade is leaning the same way. Here it was not, so I moved to the other side, and now my hand and the blade are leaning in the same direction. Now I just screw it into the model. For the hip jack rafter, I would pull layout from one truss on layout and mark it on the hip. But I don't have any more trusses than this one on the end and the one touching the hip, which isn't typically on layout. So I pull a dimension off the rafter that is touching the hip rafter, and even though I would normally have a 16-inch on center layout for rafters, my model is kind of small, so I will just arbitrarily make a mark at 11 inches. So you can see I cut a block here which is cut to 2.5 inches tall, the same height of the common rafters at the seat cut. I need to set this block flush with the outside of the wall of the model and take my measurement to the top of the block from the mark I made on the hip. On the hip, we always want the X that marks where our jack rafter goes lower than the layout line. This is because it is a lot easier to measure the long point on the jack rafter. To be more specific, the point we are measuring is on a compound bevel, so we are finding the long of a long point. I covered long point and short points in a different video, so I won't go over it again, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, now when you cut hip jack rafters, you will need another jack for every one that you cut that has an opposing compound bevel on it. When you hold the two jacks together in their respective orientations, one will have the long point on the left and one will have the long point on the right side. So the easiest way to cut the bevel right for both of them is to find a board long enough to make both pieces and then cut the board in half. This will give two beveled pieces, each with opposite angles. Then just grab the first piece that matches your needs. That is what I did here. Now I just need to lay out the jack the same way I would for a common rafter, which I covered in the last video. Notice how easy it is to hook my tape on the long point of the long point, which is often shortened and called the long. Any other point I would have to manually hold my tape measure in the right estimated spot. The other 3 points of the compound bevel are the long short, the short, and the short long. Sometimes you may need to measure to one of these other points, so you can't always measure from the long, but it is the easiest. All my plumb cuts for the jack rafters are back to the 412 plumb cuts. The only rafters that get cut at 1417 plumb cuts are the hip rafters and the valley rafters. All the other rafters, even if they join to the hip or valley rafters, will be cut at 412. This is why, if you notice, I'm not using the stair gauges against the board to mark my lines. I was having a little trouble getting this one screwed in without it moving, but I eventually got it. Once it was in, I want to check the tails to see if they plane out. All looks good, but I'll move the camera so you can see as well. This is what you want to see. No gaps in between any of the tails and the level. This way your subfascia will sit flat. The top planes out as well. I will be covering how to install subfascia in the next building basics video. Then I just need to repeat the hip jack rafter process using the other half of the board I cut with a compound bevel. Once that is installed, you can see the opposing angles. One has a long point on the left, and one has a long point on the right. Then I repeated the whole hip and hip jack rafter process on the other side, and because I ran out of regular scrap 2x4s, I used some leftover treated 2x4s, which is why it's brown. And again, I just checked to make sure everything planes out, and with that, the hip is finished. One thing I forgot to mention is that if you use a speed square to lay the hip rafters out to make the plumb cut, you use the speed square like we did in the last video, but for the hip, you swivel it to the 412 hip valley mark. When you do that, you can see that the angle of the hip is 13 point something, which is the angle of the hip and the angle of the plumb cut for the hip. And if you remember, the actual angle is 13.27, which we calculated earlier. The last thing I wanted to mention is if you look on the framing square, it says diff in jack length 16-inch centers. If you follow that line over to the 4, it says 16.88. That is how much you need to add or subtract to the length of your jack rafter for a 16-inch on-center layout as you go up or down the hip. So let's say my layout was 16 inches on center, and the one jack that I measured was 7 inches. If I needed another one going higher on the hip, I would add 7 and 16.88 to get a new jack rafter length of 23.88, which is 23 and 7/8. So you only need to find the length of one jack rafter and make sure it fits, and then you can calculate all the other ones. Same thing on the framing square goes for the diff in jack length 24-inch on center, if that's what your layout is. That is all I had for this video. As I said, I will be going over how to install the subfascia in the next video and how we normally straighten the tails of the rafter on the job site before installing the fascia. For us, it's normally done on factory-made trusses, which never have tails that line up. But as I said, I will cover this in the next video. Please give this video a like as it really helps out the channel, and consider subscribing so you don't miss out on future videos. Also, check out my description for links to all my plans and the tools I use the most. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bonus tip here, say you are hunting in a hilly or mountainous area and you see your prey in a lower valley. You use your rangefinder and see that it is 300 yards away. So you aim through your scope and line up the target with the 300-yard crosshair and pull the trigger and you miss. Even though there's no wind, you end up hitting high. I'll tell you how to correct the shot. You aim too high. This time you look through your rangefinder and it says 300 yards, but you'll also notice it says in the little corner 30 degrees. What you need to do is take the distance times the cosine of 30 degrees, which gives you 259 yards. So you actually would need to aim lower than what you would expect. The bullet traveling doesn't care about this distance. It only cares about the horizontal distance it travels, as that's the distance that gravity is affecting it. I only bring this up because I figure since I was using trigonometry in this video, I thought I would show you another cool application. Okay, now I'm done.
Oh, I like that.